You know the American Revolution, but do you know the second one? The one that happened just 10 years later, led by the very farmers who won the first? Tonight, we turn the lights down low and settle in for the story of Shays Rebellion, the violent, desperate revolt that terrified George Washington, convinced James Madison that America was failing, and ultimately forced the Founding Fathers to tear up the rule book and write a constitution. It was the farmers' revolt that nearly ended the newly born United States. If you enjoy history that is deep, dark, and designed to help you drift off, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. Imagine, if you will, a different year 1783. Not the glorious one of celebration and fireworks, but the one defined by quiet exhaustion. The war is over. The great powers of Europe have shaken hands, and the territory of the United States has been secured. But for the vast majority of people, especially those in the rural corners of the new republic, the end of the war did not bring prosperity. It brought a financial abyss. The victory over Britain was magnificent, but its cost was crushing. The new government, operating under the rickety, decentralized Articles of Confederation, was essentially a loose alliance of independent states, not a unified country. It possessed a critical, near-fatal weakness. It could not, under any circumstances, levy taxes. It could only request money from the states. And most states, having just fought a revolution over taxation, were understandably reluctant to hand over their hard-won sovereignty or their citizens' hard-earned money to a distant national Congress. To finance the war, the Continental Congress had resorted to two main strategies: borrowing vast sums of money from foreign allies like France and Dutch bankers, and, more disastrously, printing an astronomical amount of paper money. This currency, known as the Continental Dollar, was entirely unsecured. It wasn't backed by gold, silver, or any tangible asset. As the presses ran faster and faster to pay the soldiers and purchase supplies, the value of the paper plummeted. This was not inflation. This was hyperinflation, a catastrophic loss of confidence. People soon began to joke that something utterly worthless was not worth a continental. Now, the soldiers, the very men who had stood in the cold at Valley Forge, who had charged the barricades at Saratoga, returned home. They were paid not in coin, not in stable money, but in two things: Continental dollars, which quickly became excellent Kindle but poor tender, and government certificates, or IOUs, promises to pay them sometime, someday. These veterans returned to farms that had been neglected for 7 long years. Tools were broken, soil was poor, and markets were unstable. Their financial survival depended on settling those old debts, but the entire country was suffering a severe shortage of specie, or gold and silver coins. The war had effectively drained the hard currency out of the economy, and the British had immediately closed their lucrative ports in the West Indies to American trade, killing a vital source of revenue. The people who had the hard money were the wealthy merchant class, primarily concentrated in the eastern cities like Boston. They had bought up the worthless Continental certificates from the desperate returning soldiers for pennies on the dollar, effectively gambling on the new government surviving. When the government, seeking to restore its credit, finally tried to make good on those certificates, it was not the penniless veteran who profited, but the wealthy speculator. This disparity created a profound sense of betrayal. The small farmers saw themselves as the true champions of liberty, yet they were the ones now being squeezed to death by debt collectors, while the merchants, whom they saw as exploiting the country's crisis, flourished. This was not the republic they had fought for. This was not liberty. It was a new form of tyranny, not of a king, but of a merchant class operating under corrupt local laws. This is the central, bitter truth of the time, the one that sets the stage for everything that followed. The American Revolution was fought against oppressive taxes and distant authority, but only a decade later, The new American government was imposing taxes more burdensome and demanding a currency more unforgiving than anything King George III ever dared to impose. This realization was the spark that would ignite the uprising. And here's a surprising fact that illustrates the absurdity of the financial state of the United States. Even the great General Washington, who had commanded the Continental Army, was not immune to this currency chaos. In 1780, at the height of the paper money crisis, the value of the continental dollar had dropped so steeply that if Washington wanted to buy a single cup of coffee, he would have had to pay upwards of 100 continental dollars for it. The system was utterly broken, and the citizens who were suffering the most were those who had the least voice in fixing it. This debt-ridden, economically fractured backdrop of the nascent United States was a ticking time bomb. The national government was too weak to pay its debts, too weak to establish a national currency, and too weak to regulate trade. It could only stand by and watch as the states, in their desperate attempts to secure their own financial footing, passed harsh, uncompromising laws. And no state was more brutal in its pursuit of payment, no state was more unforgiving to its people than the one we turn our attention to next, Massachusetts. It was here, in the cold, unforgiving hills of the western counties, that the farmers' revolt would begin. If the nation was suffering a financial hangover, then the rural communities of western Massachusetts were experiencing a near-fatal seizure. Why here? Why was Massachusetts the epicenter of this post-war crisis? The answer lies in the state's political geography. Power was heavily concentrated in the eastern coastal cities, specifically Boston, which were dominated by wealthy merchants, creditors, and commercial interests. They held the majority in the state legislature, and they had a firm belief that their government must maintain perfect credit, even if it meant ruin for the rest of the state. While other states, like Rhode Island, issued paper money to help their debtor farmers pay off their debts, the Massachusetts legislature, under the sway of these eastern elites, refused. They insisted that all debts, and crucially all state taxes, be paid only in specie, hard coin. They did this to protect the value of the merchants' war bonds and to secure their own financial standing on the global market. The consequence, however, was devastating. For the farmer in Berkshire or Hampshire County, the concept of a gold coin was almost mythical. They operated in a traditional barter economy, trading goods like rye, pork, or leather for labor and supplies. They had no access to the coastal trade. Now they were being told that their labor and their produce were useless for paying the government. To make matters worse, the state government had imposed the highest taxes in the nation to quickly pay off its share of the war debt. These taxes often amounted to 1/3 of a farmer's annual income. To pay them in gold or silver, the farmer had one choice: sell his land, his tools, or his livestock at auction for a fraction of their worth to raise a few precious coins. And if a farmer could not pay his taxes or his private debts, the system was designed to be unforgiving. He was dragged into the Court of Common Pleas, a system that was financially incentivized to rule against him. The judges and lawyers who served on these courts were often paid by the fees collected through these very debt cases. They were directly profiting from the farmer's misfortune. The end result was not just poverty, but the absolute destruction of property and liberty. Sheriffs were constantly riding through the western towns, seizing property, and dragging farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, off to debtor's prison. Here is the bitter irony, the ultimate punchline of this betrayal. The very legal system that was supposed to secure the liberty and property fought for in the Revolution was now being used as an efficient machine to strip the common man of everything he owned and send him to rot in a jail for owing a few shillings. The courts in the eyes of the farmer had become the ultimate symbol of oppression, far more immediate and tyrannical than the king they had defeated. And a surprising fact about this debtor's crisis: many of the jails, including the one in Great Barrington, were so overcrowded with farmers that the inmates were often forced to sleep standing up, packed shoulder to shoulder in foul, freezing conditions, simply for the crime of being unable to locate a few shillings of hard coin. With petitions and legal pleas utterly failing, with their neighbors being led away in chains, these farmers soon realized there was only one way to stop the relentless march of the creditor. They had to shut down the source of the evil. They had to close the courts. Next, we meet the man who would give the farmers a name and a focus. The rise of the regulators. Enter Daniel Shays and the call to arms.
With the courthouse doors serving as a revolving gate to debtors' prison, the people of Western Massachusetts decided that the legal fight was over. It was time for direct action. But who would lead this desperate, disorganized resistance of bankrupt farmers? Into this simmering crisis stepped Daniel Shays. He was not a natural radical, nor was he a statesman. He was simply a 39-year-old farmer from Pelham, Massachusetts, and a decorated war hero. Shays had fought with distinction in the Revolution, participating in key battles like Bunker Hill and Saratoga. He even earned a ceremonial sword from the Marquis de Lafayette for his bravery. But like so many of his comrades, Shays left the Continental Army unpaid and returned home only to be instantly served with debt collection papers. He was facing the loss of his own farm, the very land he had left to fight for liberty. Shays quickly discovered he was not alone. Veterans who had fought side by side were now facing the same fate, their military certificates bought up by the same wealthy men who now controlled the state legislature. The local town meetings began boiling with resentment, and the rhetoric was hauntingly familiar. They were once again protesting taxation without representation, just as they had against Britain a decade prior. The movement needed a central figure, and Daniel Shays, with his military background and reputation for bravery, was reluctantly persuaded to step forward. The rebels took a name that resonated with revolutionary history: the Regulators. This term connected them to colonial protest movements that demanded reform and regulation from unresponsive governments. The goal of the Regulators was simple, focused, and non-lethal. They intended to shut down the machinery of debt collection. In August 1786, armed groups of regulators began to gather in front of the county courthouses, timing their arrival precisely when the courts were scheduled to open to begin foreclosure proceedings. And here is the punchline, the action that defined the early stage of the rebellion. The man whose bravery had helped secure American liberty was now using military formation and discipline not to defend the Republic, but to shut down its own courts in the name of economic survival. The sight was extraordinary. Hundreds of men, many in their old, faded Continental uniforms carrying muskets and farm tools, stood shoulder to shoulder on the courthouse steps, blocking the judges from entering. A surprising fact that highlights the seriousness of their intent. The regulators were so highly organized in their refusal to be disorderly that they would often post sentries, not just to watch for the militia, but to patrol their own camps to prevent looting, drunkenness, or any petty crime that might turn public opinion against their cause. The courts were effectively suspended. Debt collection stopped. But the government in Boston, seeing only anarchy, was determined to restore order no matter the cost. This peaceful blockading of the courts was about to escalate into a full military confrontation. This act of defiance brought the state to a terrifying crossroads, pushing the rebellion toward its moment of greatest danger. Our next story will focus on that unavoidable clash. Courthouse closures, a legal protest to halt the hand of the law. The regulators, now a cohesive force under Daniel Shays, were ready to execute their strategy, a surgical strike against the legal system. For the farmers, the courts were not abstract institutions of justice. They were the physical, local workshops of their ruin. The first major target was the Court of Common Pleas in Northampton, where a throng of over 500 armed men appeared on a late August morning in 1786. The judges, attempting to proceed, found their way blocked by the organized ranks of the farmers, who presented a simple demand. The court must not sit. If the court could not sit, then no property seizures could be authorized, no debt judgments could be issued, and no farmer could be sent to debtor's prison. This strategy was brilliant in its nonviolent effectiveness. It was a purely defensive move, a temporary ceasefire forced upon the law. As the protests spread, similar scenes played out in Worcester, Concord, and Great Barrington. In each town, the judges, faced with overwhelming numbers of armed but disciplined men, had no choice but to adjourn the court. The regulators celebrated these victories, not with destruction, but with solemnity, sometimes even reading a formal petition of grievances on the courthouse steps before dispersing. In Boston, however, this was not seen as a peaceful protest. It was viewed as the collapse of civil society. Governor Bolden and the Eastern establishment were horrified, viewing the rebels not as desperate citizens, but as anarchists, threatening the entire foundation of property rights. The merchants and creditors feared that if contracts could be ignored, the entire state and perhaps the nation would descend into chaos. And here is the punchline that underscores the escalating danger. For the Massachusetts establishment, the sight of American veterans blocking American courts was not liberty defending itself, but rather the specter of mob rule, convincing them that the revolution had simply replaced one tyranny, a king, with another, the unruly masses. In response, the legislature hastily passed two draconian measures. The first was the Riot Act, which effectively authorized the sheriff to kill any group of 12 or more armed persons without consequence. The second was a measure suspending habeas corpus, meaning that anyone suspected of supporting the rebellion could be arrested and jailed indefinitely without charge. These acts were not designed to negotiate. They were designed to crush. A surprising fact about this escalation is that when the state tried to raise a militia to counter the regulators, many of the local militia men, particularly in the western counties, were sympathetic to the farmers, or even Shaysites themselves, and simply refused to muster. The government had to rely on a privately funded army of paid professionals. The battle had moved beyond the courthouse steps. The government had drawn a line in the sand, and the next confrontation would not be a mere blockade, but a desperate fight for survival. The escalating conflict demanded weapons, and both sides knew where the biggest prize lay. We now move to the flashpoint of the entire revolt. The arsenal at Springfield, a do-or-die military confrontation.
The conflict had reached a terrifying impasse. The regulators had successfully shut down the legal system, but the government had responded by declaring them outlaws and raising a mercenary army. The farmers now faced a paid, professional force, and they desperately needed muskets, bayonets, and gunpowder to defend themselves. The greatest single source of arms in the region was the federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts. This was not just a state armory. It was a facility owned by the weak Continental Congress and filled with thousands of weapons, enough to arm an entire army. For Daniel Shays and his roughly 1,500 men, seizing this arsenal was essential to their survival. It was the key to turning a widespread protest into a legitimate military resistance. The plan was for Shays' main force, located to the east, to coordinate with two smaller columns to launch a simultaneous attack on the arsenal on January 25, 1787. However, the state government had anticipated this move. The state forces, commanded by former Continental Army General Benjamin Lincoln and heavily financed by wealthy Boston merchants, were already marching westward. General William Shepherd, leading a small dedicated force of Massachusetts militia, arrived at Springfield first and dug in to protect the federal arms. On that cold winter afternoon, Shays' main column, weary from their march through the snow, approached the arsenal grounds. They were met not by sympathetic farmers, but by General Shepherd's well-positioned militia. And here is the punchline that signaled the rebellion's fatal turn. When Daniel Shays finally met the government's military force, he did not encounter an enemy general, but General Shepherd, who ordered his men to fire not muskets, but a cannon, a terrifying symbol that the government was willing to use overwhelming, deadly force against its own citizens. Shepherd's men fired 2 warning shots over the heads of the advancing farmers. When Shays' column hesitated, a 3rd shot, a round of grape shot, was fired directly into the ranks. It was brutal and swift. 4 regulators were killed and 20 were wounded. Shays, stunned by the sudden, terrifying efficiency of the artillery, ordered an immediate retreat. A surprising fact about this encounter is that General Shepherd was reportedly so morally distraught by the order to fire on American veterans that he wept as he gave the command. However, his fear of anarchy was greater than his immediate compassion. The defeat at Springfield was a disaster. The other 2 columns of regulators, failing to coordinate, were unable to join the fight, and Shays' main force was scattered. The fate of the rebellion was now sealed, setting the stage for a desperate final pursuit through the winter wilderness. The rebellion was broken, but the chase was on. Finally, the chilling end of the revolt was a winter of despair, the rebellion's swift and brutal end. The roar of the cannon at Springfield did more than kill 4 men. It shattered the morale and organization of the regulators. Daniel Shays' forces, suddenly reduced from a cohesive army to a scattered collection of terrified farmers, fled northward into the snowy countryside. The military confrontation was over. The brutal manhunt had begun. General Benjamin Lincoln, commanding the privately funded state army, seized the advantage immediately. He recognized that winter was his greatest ally. In the freezing cold of late January and early February 1787, Lincoln led his pursuit force on a relentless, grueling chase through the hills of western Massachusetts. This was a war of attrition waged against men already depleted by debt and cold. Lincoln's troops moved quickly, often through deep snow, determined to prevent Shays from regrouping. Shays, meanwhile, attempted to establish a final refuge in the town of Petersham. The decisive blow came just 2 weeks after Springfield. Lincoln, demonstrating military brilliance by forcing his troops through a nearly impossible 30-mile forced march overnight during a blizzard, completely surprised the regulators in Petersham at dawn. Shays' men, awakened by the sound of drums and the sight of bayonets, were given no opportunity to organize a defense. And here is the punchline that summarized the rebellion's defeat. The farmers who had fought for 7 years to win independence found their own American government's army pursuing them with a ruthlessness and speed that the British forces had rarely achieved. The surprise attack resulted in a swift and total rout. 150 regulators were captured, and the rest, including Shays himself, scattered, fleeing across the border into neighboring states like Vermont, which was not yet officially part of the Union. The rebellion as an organized military threat was definitively, chillingly over. A surprising fact that highlights the sheer determination of the government to crush the revolt: General Lincoln's private army, funded by men like James Bowdoin, was paid entirely in hard cash on the spot, a luxury the Revolutionary War soldiers had never been afforded. This stark contrast solidified the farmers' belief that the new government was serving only the interests of the wealthy. With the rebels scattered and defeated, the government now faced the problem of justice, or vengeance.
The courts, previously shut down by the farmers, were about to be reopened, and the trials would be far more terrifying than the battles. We turn now to the harsh hand of retribution. The gallows and the pardon. Justice, fear, and the aftermath.
The rebellion was militarily crushed, but the political crisis was only just beginning. The government in Boston, having spent a vast privately raised sum to put down the revolt, was determined to make an example of the captured regulators. The courts, previously blocked by the farmers, were now reopened to administer a terrifying justice. Hundreds of suspected regulators were arrested. Special tribunals were set up across the western counties, and the atmosphere was thick with fear and retribution. Those deemed most guilty were put on trial for high treason against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a charge that carried the death penalty. 14 men, including Captain Shays in absentia, were condemned to hang. The government wanted blood to restore order and demonstrate that the rule of law could not be challenged by mob action. However, the severity of the sentences sparked immediate public outrage, even among those who had opposed the rebellion. The farmers had been defeated, but the underlying sympathy for their cause remained strong among the common people. And here's the punchline that exposed the government's internal conflict. Massachusetts had successfully executed a costly military action to save itself from anarchy, only to find that its victory risked sparking an even wider, more democratic revolt if it actually carried out the planned executions. In the midst of this tension, a new state election was held. The harsh policies of the sitting governor, James Bowdoin, proved deeply unpopular. The voters of Massachusetts, including many former regulators who were granted amnesty, delivered a resounding verdict. Bowdoin was voted out of office. In his place, they elected the vastly more popular John Hancock, who had previously favored a softer approach toward debtors. Hancock immediately offered a general pardon to almost all of the participants, including Daniel Shays, provided they swear a mandatory oath of allegiance. Only 2 men, John Bly and Charles Rose, were eventually executed, and their hangings were specifically ordered to make a final political statement about the consequences of treason, though they were largely seen as political scapegoats. A surprising fact about the aftermath is that Daniel Shays, after being pardoned, lived out the rest of his long life quietly in New York State, receiving a small military pension for his service in the First Revolution, the one that won America's freedom. While the farmers' immediate revolt had failed, their actions produced a profound and terrifying reaction far beyond the borders of Massachusetts. The image of citizens turning guns against their government struck fear into the hearts of the nation's founders. The news of the rebellion, the cannon fire at Springfield, and the resulting chaos did not stay confined to the snowy fields of Massachusetts. Dispatches raced across the states, filling the leaders of the young republic with a profound sense of dread. For men like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, Shays Rebellion was not a local disturbance. It was proof that the entire American experiment was on the verge of total collapse. Washington, living in retirement at Mount Vernon, was alarmed. He had worried that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, but Shays Rebellion confirmed his worst fears. He wrote to a friend expressing his deep concern that the internal conflicts threatened to make the country a byword among the nations of the world. James Madison, the quiet intellectual of Virginia, saw the revolt as a clear sign that the government could neither maintain order nor protect the fundamental right to property. If a state government could not suppress a debt-driven uprising, then what good was the Union? What force was there to stop any group of disgruntled citizens from simply seizing power? This widespread panic provided the crucial political leverage needed by those who advocated for a stronger national government, the group known as the Federalists. For years, they had argued for a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. Few had listened, but Shays' Rebellion changed everything.
The desperate act of a handful of bankrupt farmers in Massachusetts terrified the Founding Fathers so completely that it accomplished in 6 months what 6 years of political debate had failed to do. It ensured the immediate assembly of the Constitutional Convention. When the delegates finally gathered in Philadelphia in the spring of 1877, Shays' Rebellion was the elephant in the room. It was the living nightmare they had to guard against. A surprising fact about the convention is that before Shays' Rebellion, George Washington was reluctant to attend the Philadelphia Convention, partly due to poor health and a desire for retirement. However, the crisis convinced him that his presence was vital to lend legitimacy and authority to the proceedings, thus ensuring the convention's ultimate success. The memory of the farmers with muskets ensured that the new government they designed would possess the power to tax, to raise a standing army, and to suppress future insurrections. We now explore the difficult philosophical questions raised by the revolt. A necessary tumor, the debate over liberty versus license.
The suppression of Shays' Rebellion solved an immediate problem of order, but it left the young republic grappling with a much deeper question. What happens when the people's love of liberty clashes with the need for governmental authority? The revolt forced the Founding Fathers to fiercely debate the very nature of Republican governance. On one side stood figures like George Washington and Henry Knox, who saw the rebellion as unadulterated anarchy. To them, the farmers had crossed an unforgivable line. Having secured their freedom through the ballot box, any resort to arms against a government of their own choosing was treason. It was an abuse of liberty, a dangerous license. Washington believed the government needed to be strong enough to ensure that such insurrections could never succeed, lest the whole world see the American experiment as a chaotic failure. But on the other side were voices of caution, most notably Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, who was serving as the U.S. Minister to France during the rebellion, viewed the events with a degree of philosophical detachment. He famously minimized the conflict, comparing it to necessary societal friction. And here is the punchline that captures Jefferson's radical take. Jefferson declared that such occasional rebellion was a good thing for the health of the republic, stating, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." He even suggested in a letter that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and that the errors in the government were a necessary tumor which healthy bodies could cast off. This philosophical split was fundamental. The Federalists demanded order to secure property, while the Jeffersonians demanded a continuous vigilance against authority to preserve freedom. The very men who had just fought to be free were now deeply divided on the acceptable boundaries of that freedom. A surprising fact about this philosophical clash is that when Jefferson was informed of the uprising and the resulting calls for a strong national government, his primary concern was not the violence itself, but the possibility that the government would react by over-strengthening its own power and authority. He saw a greater threat in an overly powerful state than in the momentary rage of the people. Ultimately, the argument for order carried the day, leading to a new national government with powers specifically designed to prevent future Shays-like revolts. We conclude by considering how this forgotten conflict shaped the America we know today. The unfinished story, Shays' Rebellion's legacy in American government. The farmers' revolt failed. The courts were restored, and Daniel Shays faded into quiet exile. Yet this localized crisis in Massachusetts remains one of the most consequential near disasters in American history. Though often relegated to a footnote, Shays' Rebellion is the ghost story that haunted the founders as they drafted the Constitution. The rebellion directly provided the answers to the most immediate problems facing the country. The framers ensured the new federal government would have the power to tax, providing the stable revenue base the old Articles of Confederation lacked. Critically, the Constitution granted Congress the explicit power to call up the militia to suppress insurrections, a power the national government had lacked during the actual crisis. And here is the lasting punchline of the revolt.
Shays Rebellion stands as the ultimate counterexample to the revolutionary promise. It proved that liberty, unsecured by a strong rule of law, risked descending into chaos, and it ultimately compelled Americans to sacrifice some state sovereignty for national security. The lessons of the revolt also helped forge America's earliest political divisions. The Federalists, the party that championed the strong Constitution, used the specter of Shays Rebellion for years to argue against excessive democracy and to defend centralized power. The debt relief demands of the Shaysites, though defeated in Massachusetts, continued to influence state politics for decades, forcing legislatures to be more cautious and responsive to the economic plight of rural citizens. A surprising fact about the long-term legacy of the rebellion is that the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 10, specifically prohibits states from emitting bills of credit, that is, printing paper money. This clause was a direct reaction to Shays' Rebellion and the hyperinflationary policies of debtor states like Rhode Island, intended to prevent the kind of financial chaos that ignited the revolt in the first place. Today, Shays' Rebellion is an uncomfortable reminder that the foundations of the world's longest-lasting written constitution were built not just on high-minded philosophy, but on low-down, desperate economic fear. It is the story of the second revolution that failed, but in its failure ensured the survival of the first.
The story of Shays' Rebellion, a whisper in the footnotes of our history, reminds us that the American foundation was cemented not just with ideals, but with fear and desperate choices. It is a story of economic betrayal, of veterans turning against the very government they fought to create, and of the profound tension between liberty and law. If you stayed with us through the cold fields of Petersham, the smoke of the Springfield Arsenal, and the heavy silence of the gallows, then you are a true student of the past. We invite you to share a moment with us now. Wherever you are in the world listening to the echoes of 1787, whether you are unwinding late into the night or stealing a quiet moment in your day, tell us, where are you listening from right now? What time is it on your clock? And after journeying through this pivotal, frightening, and often forgotten chapter of American history, how was the ride? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections fuel this channel. Thank you for watching. Until the next forgotten crisis, good night.